To work in foreign affairs had ended, but I could not return to the Women's Union. Every day, we in the NLF office needed to expand and develop our diplomatic front in coordination with the military and political fronts. Further, I had become a foreign affairs staff person. Of course, I never imagined that I would continue that work for 14 years, until 1976, when the South was completely liberated and our country was formally reunited. Those 14 years brought many experiences, gave me a different forte, and were an important life season. Beginning in 1962, I was continuously active on the international front, joining meetings and friendship visits and then participating in official delegations. At the end of 1962, I traveled to Indonesia with Professor Nguyen Thi, General Secretary of the NLF Executive Committee. This was the Front's first official visit to a foreign country. At that time, the Indonesian Communist Party had more than 3 million members plus 10 million youth members in party mass organizations. The party had a positive influence on President Sukarno, whom Indonesians regarded as the father of Indonesian independence. Indonesia and Vietnam shared close, analogous points of history, for Vietnam seized political power 2 days after Indonesia, and then both countries faced long wars to achieve their independence. The two communist parties of the two countries were close. Indonesian Party General Secretary Dipa Nusantara Adat had great respect and admiration for Uncle Ho, whom he had met in Indonesia. When we arrived in Jakarta, the Indonesian protocol staff wanted to know the delegation members' diplomatic ranks in order to prepare the appropriate official welcoming ceremony. I did not know how to identify us. I said we were from the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which was like a government, and so the members of our delegation were like the Front's ministers. After that, the Indonesians greeted our delegation according to the exact protocol for a government and sometimes with even more ceremony. President Sukarno and many ministers of state wanted to meet with us. The Communist Party and mass organizations, including the youth and the women, organized gatherings to welcome us and expressed strong support for the Vietnamese people's struggle. The revolutionary fervor in Indonesia at that time brought me great delight. One event early in my diplomatic life is something I can never forget. Perhaps I can say that these were my first steps as a diplomat. The occasion was my second visit to Indonesia in around 1964. Our task was to encourage the Indonesian government to allow the NLF to open a representative-level diplomatic office in Indonesia. I needed to meet President Sukarno, but I did not know how to arrange such a meeting. Comrade Adat suggested I attend a gala, where I might meet the president. I immediately agreed. The Indonesians' organization for the gala was monumental. All the elite Indonesians were present. Adat whispered a few words to President Sukarno. The president came up and invited me to be his partner for the opening dance. I was terribly distressed because I did not know how to dance. Yet my assignment was to speak with the president in order to advance the Front's request. I summoned my courage and accepted his invitation. I took advantage of the first few minutes to introduce myself and present the Front's wish. But after several dancing steps, I was totally confused. Comrade Adat must have perceived the awkward situation. He hurried up and accompanied me away to a seat. By then, many people were on the dance floor. Perhaps the president and his other guests forgot about my lack of sophistication. In truth, my incompetence mortified me, but I reminded myself that at least I had completed my responsibility to my country. We also heard of General Suharto, the infamous anti-communist based in Bandung. Then, in 1965, a military coup raided the offices of the Indonesian Communist Party and its affiliated organizations, shattering the party structure. A terrible massacre occurred. The army arrested and assassinated many party leaders. This news deeply saddened us. It was especially painful because we could not help the friends who had wholeheartedly done so much for us. For a long while, I had no chance to visit Indonesia. Only in 1991, after more than 20 years, was I able to join the delegation of President Viet Cong to the Non-Aligned Movement's summit in Jakarta. Indonesia had changed perceptibly, but I was sad not to meet our friends from years past. The most memorable event for me in 1963 was the Third Congress of the Afro-Asian Peoples Solidarity Organization, AAPSO. It took place in Tanzania in March. Vietnam's resounding victories were a major inspiration for the national liberation movements of colonized peoples. In 1962, Algeria had gained independence from French colonialism. Facing the turbulent movement for national liberation, the British imperialists had granted independence to many countries. The non-aligned movement had been established, implementing the Bandung spirit. The Afro-Asian Peoples Solidarity Organization came into being within that context. Tanzania, a country in East Central Africa, had just won its independence from the British imperialists. People often said that the British were more fair than the French. I had never been sure of that statement. In fact, in Tanzania, I saw that the statement was inaccurate. Tanzania was such a vast country with huge, dense forests, yet it had very poorly developed agriculture. We drove several hundred kilometers along modern asphalt roads. The land was empty and deserted. Now and then, we could see some farmers poking with sticks, sprinkling a few corn seeds into the soil. Africa is the oldest continent on Earth and is considered the cradle of humanity. When I first visited Tanzania, farming was still on a subsistence level, as is still true in many areas of rural Vietnam. The situation was the same in the other African countries that I visited later, including Guinea, Mali, Uganda, Angola, and Mozambique. As in Vietnam, European colonialism had kept the peoples of Africa uneducated, divided, and uncertain about their abilities and their own intrinsic worth in comparison with their white rulers. Thankfully, that is changing. The peoples of Africa are so beautiful, well-built, physically strong, warm-hearted, good-natured, and genuine. We can hope that in the 21st century this ancient continent, which was colonized for so long and often with such devastating results, continues to develop according to priorities and choices formulated by the country's citizens themselves. We can all benefit as African nations increasingly take their rightful place on the world stage. The Afro-Asian Peoples Solidarity Organization has contributed to that much-needed change. This particular Afro-Asian Congress was organized in a lovely setting at the foot of famous Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest and most beautiful peak with a year-round cap of snow. I led the delegation from South Vietnam. Our delegation's main issue was joining the Secretariat in achieving permanent representation so we could speak and generate timely support for our struggle. Other countries, such as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also wished to join the Secretariat. We had support from the Soviet Union and some other nations as well as ardent support from Ben Barka, an influential leader from the Moroccan movement. As a result, the NLF became a member of the Secretariat. This was a great victory and a first in people-to-people diplomacy for the NLF. Thereafter, we always had a representative from the NLF at the AAPSO Secretariat in Cairo, Egypt. Indeed, from that time onward, we could at last launch campaigns to secure support from Afro-Asian and Latin American countries. I cannot refrain from saying at least a few words about Ben Barka. He was a true international combatant fighting with resilience for the rights of working people, for national independence, and for the equality of nations. The imperialist forces stalked him. He was found missing in 1965. AAPSO has since dedicated a Ben Barka Medal to those who have made significant contributions to the movement for Afro-Asian solidarity. In 1974, I was privileged to receive this priceless honor. I attended many international conferences on issues about women, legal affairs, economics, and other topics. Some years, I would be abroad for 7 or 8 months. In order to save on travel expenses, we would sometimes stay in the Soviet Union or China between conferences. The first few years, I kept a diary of our trips, but later on, extensive travel made it impossible to keep track. Although we kept no records, I still have my memories of the comrades who were side by side with me during those challenging years of turmoil and complexity. I remember Bin Tan, cherished as a younger sister of whom I was very fond. Even now, my heart feels torn when mentioning Bin Tan. I knew her from the Saigon student movement in the 1950s. An excellent student and a great activist, she had beauty, a strong character, and a special quality of mind and manners. She was someone whom everyone loved. Bin Tan was my secretary, since she excelled in both English and French. In fact, she was more like an intimate companion, sharing both sad and happy moments as well as the trials and tribulations of our everyday life. For a while after 1975, Bin Tan was Vietnam's ambassador to Germany. Then she was assigned to Vietnam's delegation at the United Nations. Although she was a very talented woman, Bin Tan's private life was not very happy. Her life ended in a tragic motorbike accident while on her way to attend the funeral of Bình Nguyen Thi Binh, a mutual friend and a colleague from our years together in Paris. Ngoc Dung, whose real name was Zan, was my age and had been a top student of Petrus KY School. She joined the Vietnam Women's Union in the South as a journalist. Dung was also a member of our negotiating delegation in Paris, so our international activities meant that our paths crossed frequently. Ngoc Dung was spirited and bright, always coming up with new initiatives. She was full of energy and an enthusiastic worker. Since Dung and I fully understood each other, we worked well together, with every task efficiently coordinated. Later on, she was Vietnam's ambassador to the United Nations. As for my fellow comrades, I feel special appreciation for Vo Dong Giang, Hoang Bich Sun, Duong Din Thao, Le Phuong, and Li Van Sao. All have left me with permanent memories. I have always had many friends, with whom I could share thoughts and ideas as well as difficulties and challenges. That closeness gave me greater self-confidence and strength. From 1963 to 1968, I participated in many international women's conferences, including meetings held in Moscow, Russia, Sofia, Bulgaria, and Nimes, France. Women throughout the world strongly supported Vietnam's struggle, but they did not always sympathize with all our claims. At the International Women's Executive Committee meeting in Salzburg, Austria, Jeanette Vermeersch, who had shown constant support, nevertheless objected, saying, "Why do you emphasize the United States as an imperialist aggressor? If you stopped calling the Americans aggressors, then we could immediately support your statement." I smiled and replied, "Sister Jeanette, I think that we have condemned them so little that our words have been to no avail. Perhaps that is the reason we have failed to capture the Americans' attention." We laughed and hugged. Jeanette said, "All right then. We love the people of Vietnam, so we will try it your way." The conference passed a resolution strongly condemning the United States. Our friends loved us not only because they affirmed our just cause but also because they admired the determination and sacrifice coming from a small nation standing up against a colossal empire. We were ready to sacrifice all and determined not to be enslaved. Our narrative was like the biblical story of David against Goliath. The more we fought, the more we were triumphant. We had to work so our friends from all continents would understand that the United States was conducting a war of aggression in the south of Vietnam. We also had to state clearly that the NLF was the only true representative of the Southern people in the struggle against U.S. aggressors. This was not easy in the first few years. Our goal was to quash the Saigon administration's claims as nationalist and patriotic. We persevered even when some foreign sympathizers remained uncomfortable with what they considered as our inflexible stance. We would explain our point of view until we convinced them. Later on, after the 1968 Tet Offensive, when lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao set up the Alliance of National, Democratic, and Peace Forces, we no longer claimed that the NLF was the only true representative of the South of Vietnam. However, then we encountered disagreement from the same friends. Now, they argued that even if other patriotic forces joined us, we should still portray the front as the only worthy and true representative. To this, we repeated our point that the NLF's fundamental intent was to rally all forces in common struggle to build a broad-based movement so that our friends would agree with us out of comradeship and trust. Our role was difficult for governments. Even though the Soviet Union supported our struggle, the Soviets were cautious and restrained when using terms such as American imperialism or aggression. We would have long, elaborate discussions in order to produce joint statements with the governments of the countries we visited. Only through perseverance could we reach agreement on terminology. In most cases, our international colleagues would avoid mentioning the United States by name, and they would use interference instead of invasion. This demonstrated how powerful the United States was internationally and how resilient and determined we were in the face of such a formidable challenge. One of our key objectives was to gather the support of anti-war and peace groups in the United States. The first time I met representatives of the American anti-war movement was at a two-day conference held in Bratislava, now in the Republic of Slovakia, in 1967, with about 40 attendees. I was not impressed with these Americans at first sight. They were not dressed tidily, and their way of speaking seemed overly casual. Yet when I described the situation in Vietnam, the American participants listened attentively and asked many questions. I spoke especially about the war in the South, including the American military's crimes, and I expressed our people's aspirations for peace and independence. I also emphasized that we had no ill intentions regarding U.S. interests. The ambiance became increasingly relaxed as the conference progressed and as the participants came to feel closer to one another. By the end, we were shaking hands and holding hands and promising to alert the public, especially in the United States, so that the world would grasp the reality of what was happening in Vietnam. We asserted that, together, we would strengthen our solidarity to end the war, a war the American public had never wanted. I also joined two separate meetings with American women, one in Jakarta, 1965, and one in Paris, 1967. These meetings were distinctive because the women were inherently more open and tolerant than their male colleagues. Many American friends could not hold back their tears when they heard descriptions of the suffering of Vietnamese women and children. These meetings were held mainly at the initiative of Women's Strike for Peace. After 1975, I met again old friends, such as Cora Weiss and Mary Clark from the United States. They had been active members of this movement, women whom I regard as friends. I can never forget them, because they spent a precious part of their lives fighting bravely for Vietnam. Between 1963 and 1965, disagreements appeared within the international revolutionary movement. These negatively affected the struggle in many countries, including Vietnam. At first, China launched a campaign criticizing Yugoslavia's revisionism, and then China launched a media campaign so that the sharp, bitter Chinese arguments could easily persuade listeners. Then China switched to attacking the Soviet Union directly and condemning Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union's leader, as a pro-American revisionist. Our policy through both the resistance war against France and the resistance war against the United States had been to secure support from the Socialist bloc and especially from the two big brothers, the Soviet Union and China. We needed to build a strong foundation under our own struggle. We tried to maintain our stance, but this was not always easy. In July 1963, a loud dispute erupted at the International Women's Congress in Moscow between the Chinese delegation and the organizing committee. A Chinese representative grabbed the microphone to assert the Chinese stance. Total confusion ensued, ending the conference. I was head of the Vietnamese delegation. Although we were close to the Chinese delegation, we did not approve of the delegation's conflict with the organizers. From that incident onward, the Chinese delegations were absent from all conferences of international democratic organizations. Around the middle of 1964, Chairman Khrushchev held a large welcoming reception at the Kremlin meeting hall during the Peace Congress in Moscow. This event won the sympathy of representatives from many countries. As head of the NLF delegation, I was wondering what to say when I met Chairman Khrushchev, whose reputation had been challenged. Finally, my turn came. I approached, shook hands with Chairman Khrushchev, and introduced the NLF as representative for the people of the South who were struggling against the United States. I thanked the people of the Soviet Union for supporting our just struggle. I also expressed our hope that, along with many other countries, the Soviet Union would support Vietnam even more. I was not sure if the interpreter repeated everything I said, but I did notice that Chairman Khrushchev smiled and nodded. I sighed with relief, knowing that I could not have stated our position more correctly. The 1968 Tet General Offensive erupted when I was in Hanoi to prepare for a trip to France. The whole country watched as the People's Liberation Army attacked and besieged American buildings and bases. From this point forward, people had more faith in the strength of our guerrilla forces. In April 1968, I received an invitation to a women's conference in Nimes, France. Two important events occurred as I was traveling to Paris. First, the French student movement protested the government's education policy, a protest that overlapped with many social groups' dissatisfaction with the de Gaulle government. Several of the large demonstrations in France interrupted public life. At the same time, Vietnam opened communication between the DRVN government represented by Minister Xuan Thuy and the United States government represented by Ambassador Averell Harriman to explore the prospect of political negotiations. As the Tet 1968 general offensive spread across the southern battlefield, the United States began to recognize the impossibility of winning a war against a people so determined to fight for independence, freedom, and their country's reunification. The need to de-escalate the war became apparent to American leaders, forcing them to consider a political solution to extract the United States from an increasingly hopeless war. However, the United States also wanted to negotiate from strength. We saw this as a timely opportunity to fight on two fronts with a combined strategy: attack on the battlefield and negotiate at the conference table. When I met Xuan Thuy in Paris during that trip for the Women's Conference, I believed the diplomatic struggle would gain in importance. However, I certainly did not expect to return to the magnificent capital of France 6 months later with an assignment involving enormous responsibility. That assignment would mark a turning point in my work and life. 6. The longest peace negotiation in history. In the middle of July 1968, the Committee for Reunification invited comrades Duong Dinh Thao, Ly Van Sao Ngoc Dung, several others, and myself to a briefing on the party's directive for its new strategy, attack on the battlefield and negotiate at the conference table. We understood that it was not yet the right time to resolve the issues between the United States and the National Liberation Front. Instead, we would undertake a new form of struggle. On the battlefield, we had to fight even more vigorously so the U.S. Saigon administration would realize that its cruelty could not overcome us and that the war had reached a decisive point. At the same time, the situation created the chance for us to open a widespread diplomatic front. We could help the world understand even more clearly the schemes and cruelty of the United States in Vietnam. We needed to highlight the U.S. intention to force its domination over our small, poor nation, which wanted only peace and freedom and which couldn't possibly hamper American interests. This new diplomatic front could enhance our influence on international and U.S. public opinion, isolate the forces of aggression, and provide effective support for the battlefield. Of course, we also believed that eventually the war would end and the two parties would sign a peace agreement at the negotiating table. After almost 6 years of diplomatic activities for the National Liberation Front, NLF, the front, or the Viet Cong, of South Vietnam, I had accumulated some knowledge and experience in diplomatic and political struggle. However, I never guessed I would have the good fortune to receive this challenging, complex, and important assignment to help represent my country at the historic negotiations in Paris with the goal of ending the war and restoring peace. Those negotiations, which may have been the longest in world history, began in November 1968 and ended on January 27, 1973, with diplomatic follow-up in Paris lasting until that June. When I left Hanoi at the end of October 1968, I never expected the negotiations to last so long. Before leaving, I phoned Kang at the military engineering school in Bac Giang province and arranged to see him. I felt perplexed because I did not know how to tell my husband the news, and I did not know what to say to my children, who were too young to understand that I might be away for an indefinite time. Kang understood that I needed to undertake an important task. He didn't ask for specifics but only encouraged me. "You have a mission you must fulfill," he said. "Leave for your assignment with peace of mind. The children have me and your father to care for them." I loved Kang even more dearly at that moment and was endlessly grateful to him. I left home with so many feelings, yet I constantly reminded myself that I must work to the limit of my strength to complete my responsibility. Our leaders had placed their confidence in me. I had to live up to that confidence. I took with me the principles of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, several documents with guidance for the struggle, and President Ho's valuable advice, which comrades at the Reunification Committee had reproduced. During the struggle, it was crucial always to hold to this central, underlying norm. Retain immutable principles during myriad changes. I think our two Vietnamese delegations, from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, carried out these directives precisely. Comrades Duong Dinh Thao, Binh Thanh, Phan Ba, Nguyen Van Khai, and I were the members of the first NLF delegation to depart for the preparatory meetings. We flew by way of Beijing and Moscow. We told everyone the reason for our trip was a mission to Cuba. At around 2:00 p.m. on November 2, 1968, we landed at Le Bourget Airport north of Paris just as the weather in France was beginning to turn chilly. From the airplane, we could see crowds of people waiting to greet us. Such excitement, emotion, and joy. We encouraged each other to look dignified and smile, just as Comrade Xuan Thuy had gently reminded us. That day, I was wearing a dark pink Vietnamese áo dai, our traditional dress, over which I wore a gray coat and a flower-adorned black scarf. As soon as we entered the terminal, many journalists and photographers surrounded us, even though hefty Vietnamese and French security guards escorted us. With all the jostling, I barely escaped falling. Bin Tan, my secretary and official interpreter, and I stayed close together the entire time. Our mission was to state clearly the purpose and significance of the NLF delegation at the Paris conference. I tried to speak loudly but with dignity. Bin Tan interpreted in such a clear and coherent style that many praised her, saying she spoke French extremely well, like a native French speaker. Many people crowded in to see, hear, and photograph the delegation. The chaos made it seem as if the furniture were splintering and the windows were cracking. We were taken to Villa Thievnet, the site that our comrades in the delegation from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRVN or North Vietnam, had arranged for us. We were startled to see the journalists and photographers following us. Some were climbing over the villa's walls, while others poked their cameras through slits in the gate to snap a few shots of the Viet Cong. We had a good laugh and reassured each other, saying, "We came here to disseminate information about our front and affect public opinion. Why should we flinch from these journalists? On the contrary, we should welcome them. Of course, first we needed a meaningful plan." 2 days later, we held a large press conference with over 400 reporters from the international press. This was my first exposure to so many journalists. I spoke, presenting the Front's legitimate position and our goodwill in seeking a peaceful solution. The journalists competed to ask their questions. I hid my worry and fear that I would say something to expose a weakness the journalists could exploit. Outwardly, I remained calm and poised. The articles the journalists wrote after that press conference were all sympathetic. No one picked holes. After all, a gentle, petite woman from a land where war raged had stood before them, speaking with reason and feeling. Indeed, our first steps had created sympathy among the press. During the following days, many journalists and television companies requested separate interviews. Some days, we even had several press sessions. The work was nerve-wracking, particularly with those TV lights shining in my face. The brothers and sisters in the delegation encouraged me, saying, "So they paying lots of attention to the NLF delegation. That's exactly what we wanted." The four-party preparatory meetings began on November 6, 1968. But the United States pointed out that the representatives from the Saigon administration had not yet arrived. Another reason to delay was procedural, including the question of the shape of the negotiating table. World diplomatic history had never seen negotiations begin with an extended struggle over the negotiating table's shape. Although many people joke about that stage, there were important reasons for this extended discussion because the shape and seating arrangements at the main table symbolized the political and legal characteristics of the four sides. From May until October 1968, the discussions between Comrade Xuan Thuy, head of the DRVN delegation, and U.S. Ambassador Averell Harriman had been very heated about the role of the National Liberation Front. On our side, we made it clear that the front was the representative of the Southern people who opposed the United States. Thus, the NLF must be one of the negotiating parties. However, the United States held that the front was composed of people from the North, meaning communists, who wanted to overthrow the nationalists, whom the United States supported in the South. We asserted in response that the United States had chosen and established the Saigon administration, which was therefore clearly composed of American hirelings. Thus, the struggle over whether the table would present four sides or two sides had important political significance. We requested a square table for its four equal sides or a round table divided into four equal sectors. The United States insisted on a rectangular table for two sides or a round table divided into two. Here is a little-known detail. Comrade Xuan Thuy's delegation received many table designs from world-famous furniture companies. Ambassador Harriman's delegation probably received just as many brochures. In the end, Comrade Zon Thuy and Ambassador Harriman reached unity, deciding on a large round table 8 meters in diameter and covered with a green cloth. Their plan divided the table into halves. The 4 sides had dividing lines, which were clearly defined by the reserved staff space behind each delegation. In this way, everyone could interpret the table's design as 2-sided or 4-sided depending on his or her point of view. The delegations from the United States and the Saigon administration sat close together as if they were one. However, on our side, the Front and the DRVN sat as 2 separate delegations. The seating arrangement was not advantageous for the Americans and the Saigon administration, since people could clearly see that the Saigon authorities were little more than lackeys of the Americans. Given that configuration, how could the Saigon administration claim to represent the people of the South? The preparatory meeting began on November 27, 1968. It was a simple meeting primarily to decide technical issues, such as the number of official participants and the order of presentations. The formal, 4-sided conference did not begin until January 25 of the following year. Comrade Tran Bu Kiem served as head of the NLF delegation, while Comrade Tran Hoai Nam and I served as deputy heads. Our having 2 delegations, the DRVN and the NLF, is a special case, unique in the history of international diplomatic relations. I believe I should speak clearly about this point. We presented our 2 delegations as representatives of one struggle under the unified leadership of the Vietnamese Workers' Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party. In terms of foreign political presentation, we had established a unified position. Although 2, we are 1. Although 1, we are 2. The 2 delegations with 2 different populations, the NLF in the south and the DRVN in the north, reinforced each other's strength. As a result, our foreign affairs front was expansive and lively. We could contribute to victory in our shared struggle to oppose American aggression, seize independence, and reunite our country. We all know these historical truths. The Vietnamese Workers' Party and the DRVN government led our country's war of resistance against France. They seized the resounding Vietnamese victory at Dien Bien Phu and forced France to sign the Geneva Agreement in 1954. After that, France and other nations accepted Vietnam's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Nevertheless, the United States did not sign the joint statement at Geneva. Given the international conditions during the middle of 1954, we Vietnamese had to accept the temporary division of our country into 2 sectors, with reunification expected to follow a nationwide general election 2 years later. However, the ink on the agreements had not yet dried when the United States intervened in Vietnam, replacing France. The United States discarded the 1954 Geneva Agreement, adopted a scheme to keep our country divided for a long time, and intended to turn South Vietnam into a new American colony. On December 20, 1960, after 4 years of intense but unsuccessful political struggle, the people of South Vietnam established the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, a movement uniting people from all strata of society. Our goal was to lift aloft the banner of continued struggle against the invaders and to demand independence and reunification of our country. The NLF announced its peaceful and neutral stand in a policy appropriate to the situation, emphasizing the aspirations of the people of the South and taking advantage of wide support from the peoples of the world. The Front's membership included a wide variety of people, among them progressive revolutionary forces, activists from religious, peace, and social groups, various political parties, and people who did not favor socialism and who even feared communists. For nearly 16 years, the NLF's blue and red flag with its 5-pointed gold star flew on 5 continents as a true symbol of the people's struggle in the South. At the four-party conference in Paris, the NLF, as representative of the Southern people directly involved in the war, presented political solutions aimed at ending the war and restoring peace. We used flexibility, responding to every change in the armed struggle with initiatives to expand and clarify our goodwill, take advantage of public opinion, and push our opponents into increasing embarrassment. These were our diplomatic offensives. The DRVN, as representative of the people of the North and as the rearguard for our military struggle in the South, consistently heightened the Front's role and supported every solution we presented. Even now, in my memory, I can still hear Comrade Zon Thuy,'s composed, calm, self-possessed voice every time I announced a new initiative. "I completely agree with me. Bin," he would say. That was our external presence. However, internally, we closely coordinated the two delegations through one source of flexible, precise guidance, which came from inside our country. The negotiations, opening gambit about seating forced the United States to recognize the existence of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. This marked an important early stage of the negotiations and a major U.S. defeat. The arguments at the conference table were lengthy, for the NLF and DRVN delegations openly and publicly criticized and denounced the United States. The American delegation would sidestep and push the Saigon delegation into long-winded responses. After 5 months of meetings, on August 8, 1969, U.S. President Nixon announced his Vietnamization policy for the war. His idea use Vietnamese to fight Vietnamese caused international journalists to describe the policy as changing the color of the corpse's skin. The French Kléber International Conference Center was located on Kléber Avenue about 100 meters away from the Arc de Triomphe in the center of Paris, the capital of France. Although the building was not large, its architecture was majestic. A drawing room led to a large meeting hall surrounded by rooms for small meetings. The meeting hall had 2 main doors. The US and Saigon delegations used one door, while the DRVN and NLF delegations used the other. The first session was an important event. The entire world turned its attention on Kléber Center in hopes that the conference would find an early solution to end the war, which had already caused a decade of extensive suffering. Journalists arrived in large numbers. The people of Paris, in particular our overseas Vietnamese compatriots, held aloft red DRVN flags with gold stars and blue and red NLF flags with gold stars to welcome our 2 delegations. Here and there were several 3-striped red and yellow flags representing the Saigon administration. It is hard to describe the feelings of our overseas Vietnamese kin when they saw the flags of our homeland and the National Liberation Front flying in the middle of Paris. This was particularly true on the opening day of the Paris Conference, an important event tied to our people's heroic and painful struggle. Uncountable lives had been lost under those 2 glorious flags. One elderly overseas Vietnamese expressed his deep emotion. "For so many years," he said, "we haven't been allowed to display our flag. Some have been imprisoned just for holding aloft our flag. Now, we see our people raising high our country's flag, and we see the French police escorting our representatives through Paris. We could not be happier. As for us, we had the honor to arrive in Paris as representatives for the people of Vietnam's sectors. The people of the North and of the South were engaged in a long war against those who would deny us independence. We understood that even though our mission presented us with many difficulties, our challenges could never compare with the martyrdom of our warriors in the battlefields. We knew that we stood on a diplomatic front line, which strove to contribute to victory on the battlefield. Every Thursday for 4 years, our two delegations arrived at the Kleber International Conference Center to accomplish our primary responsibility. Through public discussion, we would expose to the world the American scheme of invasion and thus clarify our just cause for the independence, freedom, and reunification of our people. It is worth noting that 3 delegations at the conference did not include any women. The delegation from the Saigon administration did have me, Nguyen Thi Binh, at the beginning, but then we never saw her again. Only the NLF-PRG delegation had long-haired warriors from the South in Paris. There is also the interesting question of technical equipment. The DRVN and NLF delegations had only one small tape deck to record each delegation's speeches, whereas the U.S. side had every type of modern equipment and could consult directly with Washington. In truth, the disparity of forces at Paris was rather unequal. However, we were not lacking in argumentation, particularly when everyone could see Comrade Xuan Thuy's firm, composed, self-possessed demeanor. In June 1969, after formation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government (PRG) of the Republic of South Vietnam, Tran Bu Kiem, the NLF's head of delegation, returned to serve as minister for our Office of Government. I received the heavy responsibility of replacing him. Xuan Thuy and I served as delegation leaders until the conclusion of the conference. During the 5 years of the Paris Conference, the head of the U.S. delegation changed 5 times: Averell Harriman, Henry Cabot Lodge, Philip Habib, David K. E. Bruce, and William J. Porter. Many commentators joked, "The Viet Cong will definitely win because they are so steady." This disparity in management of personnel illustrated our iron will. At the conference table, I usually paid close attention to the 2 opposing delegations, particularly to the delegation from the Saigon administration, which Pham Dang Lam headed for many years. As I looked at them, I would ask myself, what are they thinking about the future of the country and themselves? In truth, Mr. Lam and many people on the delegation of the Saigon administration did not face us with an attitude of enmity. Later, I learned that Pham Dang Lam's homeland was in Ben Tre province and that he had many friends within the ranks of the NLF. For Tet, the Lunar New Year of the Rooster, 1969, the overseas Vietnamese in Paris organized splendid festivities to welcome the DRVN and NLF delegations. One large meeting at the Mutualite Meeting Hall gathered together several thousand overseas Vietnamese compatriots and friends from France and other nations. The elderly, the brothers and sisters who were laborers, and those who were intellectuals grasped our hands, reluctant to part. A formally dressed man of about 30 came up to me. "Do you remember me?" he said. "I was your student at Nam Viet School. Now, I have a doctorate." Truly, my time as a teacher had been a long time before. During 1954–1955, Duy Lien and I taught at Nam Viet School, which was headed by Professor Pham Hoi Thong. So much water had flowed under the bridge since that time. I regret that I did not have time to ask my former student for his name. I was delighted that he had valued our teaching. In April 1969, I visited England. During the war in Vietnam, Great Britain, the closest U.S. ally in Europe, supported the U.S. policy of aggression. Therefore, members of NLF mass organizations could not secure visas to England. But by 1969, the United States sat at the same table with the National Liberation Front at the Paris Conference. Great Britain no longer had any reason to hinder us. My visit to England was an event. British friends were delighted and organized an enthusiastic welcome. Many organizations in England supported our struggle, but for many reasons, these activists could not coordinate their activities. Nevertheless, a forest of people congregated at Trafalgar Square, the largest public square in London. The participants paraded with banners announcing "Solidarity with Vietnam" and "Stop the War." Our British friends led me up to the base of the statue, the highest place in the square, so I could speak. Whenever the representatives of the various organizations spoke, people in the audience erupted into heated discussions among themselves, creating a turbulent atmosphere. Yet when the MC introduced a representative of Vietnam, everyone became quiet. Each person strained to hear. At first, standing up there so high, I felt rather nervous, but after a few minutes facing the sympathetic attitude and respect emanating from the audience, I became forceful. At the end of the rally, my friends and the organizing committee accompanied me in a march, where I was flanked by 2 rows of tall, stout security guards. Indeed, it was true that in the imperialist countries the government's policy and the people's wishes were opposite. The people of every country value justice. Their deep wish is always tied directly to a peaceful life and friendly relationships. During that visit, I also had the chance to meet directly with members from the Labour Party in the British Parliament. I described for them the Vietnamese situation and our position. During the mid and late 1960s and early 1970s, many remarkable events occurred in the U.S. anti-war movement. Norman Morrison immolated himself at the Pentagon. The student movement erupted on college campuses. National Guardsmen killed 4 students during a demonstration at Kent State University, and there were massive vigils in Washington and other cities. Late in April 1969, I returned to Hanoi to receive new directives. I visited my father in the Soviet Vietnamese Friendship Hospital, where he had been hospitalized for several months. That was the last time I saw my father. At the end of May, while in Paris, I received the news of his death. I was in immense pain, reproaching myself that I had not been at his side during his last moments. During that same trip back home, Uncle Ho invited me to visit and share a meal. He inquired about the work of the negotiations in Paris and about the overseas Vietnamese compatriots in France and England. Uncle Ho reminded me about the importance of taking part in the campaigns of people from different countries, since these ordinary people were the ones who truly valued justice and peace. I did not realize that this would be the last time I would meet with Uncle Ho. I brought back with me to the conference the Front's 10-point solution. Comrade Tran Bu Kiem, head of the NLF delegation, announced this position in the meeting at Kleber Center on May 8, 1969. The impact of the 10 points was huge, especially on American public opinion. These points explained the forceful actions that had such a decisive effect in the United States at that time. Then in early September came the event that brought us relentless sorrow. Uncle Ho, the esteemed father of our nation, passed away when the efforts of our people reached a decisive phase. On September 2, Comrade Xuan Thuy and I returned to Hanoi in mourning for Uncle Ho. The whole country was in deep sorrow. Although I have mentioned the shift from the NLF to the PRG before, I feel a fuller explanation might be useful. The National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which had been established 8 years before with good weather, favorable terrain, and concord among the people, had grown like Phu Dong. We had established NLF committees in each area of the South, including in areas the enemy temporarily occupied. Other countries, including many socialist countries and other friendly nations, had officially recognized the NLF as a government, even though we still used the front in our name. However, we had reached the point where we needed to establish a government in order to manage the increase in our liberated areas and to have an official voice for the people of the South in the international arena. On June 6, 1969, we formally established the Provisional Revolutionary Government (PRG) of the Republic of South Vietnam with 12 domestic and foreign policies. Here was a new development in our resistance movement against the United States and South Vietnam. The government had an advisory council with lawyer Nguyen Hu Tho as president, lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao as vice president, and with the participation of many other patriotic intellectuals. The head of government was architect Nguyen Tan Phat. At the time, I was in Paris. The newly formed government in the South selected me as foreign minister and simultaneously as head of our PRG delegation at the four-party Paris conference. I succeeded Comrade Tran Bu Kiem, who returned to Vietnam to serve as Minister of the Office of Government. To be honest, I was not pleased to hear about my appointment as foreign minister, for I saw that my responsibilities would be far heavier. The announcement of the foundation of the PRG was an important event. People inside the country were delighted. Saigon was in an uproar, and international public opinion paid close attention. We predicted several possibilities when we announced at the negotiations that I would be replacing Comrade Tran Bu Kiem as our delegation's head, and when we simultaneously announced that we would be taking part in the meetings as the newly established Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. For example, the U.S. representatives might have objected and stopped the talks. We certainly did not expect to hear the American head of delegation gasp in surprise and then say, "Your choice of representative is your internal affair." For our two delegations, those celebratory days in Paris were like a festival. I received many flowers and congratulatory cards and was constantly meeting delegations. The DRVN delegation led by Comrade Le Duc Tho and Comrade Zon Thuy arrived first. Then the Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban ambassadors to France arrived to present their congratulations and announce their government's formal diplomatic recognition of the PRG. Then the Association of Overseas Vietnamese in France, the French Communist Party, and representatives of mass organizations of women, youth, and laborers arrived in turn. International journalists quickly announced the news. Within a short time, 20 countries announced their official diplomatic recognition of the PRG. These included Cuba and Algeria, two special friends of Vietnam. Most of these other nations were also in the socialist camp. With these steps, our representation of the South at the conference table became even more articulate, tenacious, and dignified. Our delegation's composition did not change significantly. I replaced Comrade Tran Bu Kiem as delegation head. Comrades Dinh Ba Thi and Nguyen Van Tien became deputy delegation heads. Sister Duy Lien returned home, but Sister Nguyen Thi Chan joined us, and then the following year, Sister Phan Thi Minh arrived. Our delegation in Paris was based mainly at Verrières-le-Buisson, Cambyses Road, with part of the group at Massy, 5 or 6 kilometers away in a working-class area. Our whole delegation had 30 people, including officials and support personnel. Only 10 of us, myself, Bin Tan, several protocol officials, and security personnel, lived at Verrières-le-Buisson in an old, scenic villa atop a broad hill overlooking a lake with swans. Indeed, it was a poetic setting. Behind the villa was a small garden with a dozen cherry trees. In the afternoon, we women in the delegation would often pick cherries and chat. The comrades responsible for cooking our meals planted a small vegetable garden and raised chickens in the yard between the villa's kitchen and the row of neighboring houses. After our nerve-wracking work sessions, we diplomats would water the vegetables and feed the chickens as a diversion. We lived at the Verrières-le-Buisson villa for 5 years, 5 years of the swans, life on the lake, and 5 years history can never forget. The French government provided a police escort whenever the delegation traveled in an official capacity. A police car led the procession, while the car with the head of delegation had 4 motorcycle escorts, with 2 on each side. Whenever the entire delegation went to a meeting at Kleber Conference Center, We became a cavalcade led by a police car and 8 accompanying police officers on motorcycles. The French Communist Party was the organization most helpful to the delegation. We had only a few security officers from Vietnam. The French Communist Party supplied all the other security officials and the vehicle drivers as a contribution. Most members of our PRG delegation were political officials from many different local areas and different state branches. We had only one military official. We worked together amidst great unity, for we shared deep feelings about our parentage and heritage in the South. We constantly thought of our loved ones struggling in our ancestral villages and felt we must execute our responsibilities to the very best of our abilities. Bin Tan, my secretary, was a very sensitive person. She would often say, "Ours is an endearing community." We seldom went out just for the fun of it, although we would occasionally gather up the entire delegation and go to a park or to the forest to gather mushrooms. The house at Massey had 2 ping-pong tables. In the evenings, the brothers and sisters there would play ping-pong or boulet. The foreign press, in particular the French, would compare our delegation with the one from the Saigon administration. With high salaries supported by the United States, the Saigon administration delegates had the means to visit many entertainment sites in and around Paris. Some journalists wrote that our office was like a monastery of men without their wives and a convent of women without their husbands. We lived frugally, economizing whenever and wherever we could. Some journalists wanted to film the daily living conditions of the head of the Viet Cong delegation, but we firmly declined, offering the excuse that Vietnamese customs would not approve of publicizing a woman's private living quarters. The truth is that we could hardly show anyone the room where Bin Tan and I lived. It was upstairs, directly under the mansard roof. The space was so tight that our 2 beds were as close together as cots in a Vietnamese hospital ward. Curious journalists sometimes asked where I went to have an ao dai made, where I went to the hairdresser, and which beauty salon I used. I would provide an elusive answer by way of an anecdote. Some reporters would ask in a fault-finding tone, "Aaron, you a member of the Communist Party?" I would smile and answer, "I am a patriot. My party is a patriotic party determined to struggle for our country's independence and freedom." Then there were the journalists who commented, "Your name means peace, but you speak only of war." How could I respond to that challenge except by raising the question of the American war of aggression and by speaking clearly about the meaning of our people's determination to achieve peace, independence, and freedom? Those journalists had to conclude that we never wanted war. Rather, the French colonizers and the American imperialists had forced our people to stand up and defend themselves. To sharpen our arguments at the negotiating table and to buttress wider public discussion, we read books about world history and particularly about our own country's history. I especially like to read about the period of Le Loi and Nguyen Thi in the 15th century. 500 years before us, our ancestors had organized a very skillful, coordinated struggle on 3 fronts: political, military, and diplomatic. Nguyen Thi's diplomatic letters were unsurpassable, at times strong and at times conciliatory, as he pressured and persuaded his Chinese opponents to withdraw their troops from our country. Nearly 6 centuries later, we were following our country's tradition of fighting the aggressors. Like our forefathers, we were using both bravery and intelligence. In addition to preparing for meetings at Kleber Conference Center, we had to set aside considerable time to meet with the press. For me, there were periods when it seemed like I was meeting daily with 1 or 2 television companies or with journalists from newspapers in France, the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. The list goes on. In general, the attitude of the press was sympathetic toward the DRVN delegation and particularly toward the PRG delegation. The brothers in the 2 delegations would tease us, saying, "The Westerners fawn over you women." We faced highly sensitive issues. We would discuss them extensively to reach unified, appropriate answers. The external relations front was its own battlefield. Perhaps we can say that we viewed our arguments presented at any given point as also leading to our country's victory. Our opponents and the journalists would persist in asking whether Northern Vietnamese troops were in the South. We had received a directive. You must not say Northern troops are in the South. You must not say Northern troops are not in the South. And so, I would answer, the Vietnamese people are one. The Vietnamese in the North, just like the Vietnamese in the South, all have the same obligation toward society to fight against aggression. The journalists would turn their questions this way and turn them that way, but I would hold to that one approach whenever I answered. In the end, the persistent journalists had to reconcile themselves to accepting my response as stated. In 1969, we announced that our liberated area covered 2/3 of the South. Then, in 1971, we announced that we had expanded our liberated area to 3/4 of the South. At that time, our main force troops in the battlefield faced many difficulties. The war had forced some of our troops to slip over the border into Cambodia. The enemy bombed everywhere, even the areas just outside Saigon. We discussed with each other how to respond to journalists. The United States is bombing everywhere. I would say, most of the places the United States has destroyed are in our liberated areas. If it is not true that we control so much territory, then why is the United States bombing everywhere? This reasoning was so clear that it caused the journalists to nod their heads in agreement. I remember most of all a large meeting in the middle of 1971 with TV journalists. French television had taken the initiative to organize a live, simultaneous broadcast from two sites, one in Paris and one in Washington. 20 journalists took part. 10, who were mostly Americans, would protect the U.S. position. 10 others, who were mostly French, would be neutral and objective. I was invited to take part, but I wavered. I kept thinking I would be all by myself and stupefied in the midst of so many sharp-tongued journalists. I had never met any of them, and I would have to debate directly in French. Comrade Duong Dinh Thao, our press attaché, and the other brothers and sisters in our delegation encouraged me. They said this was a great opportunity to introduce the entire world to our just position and to expose the U.S. schemes and cruelty. And so, they said, I should make the most of this opportunity. The broadcast was nearly 2 tension-filled hours under bright studio lights. For the most part, the journalists focused on the usual positions of the United States and Vietnam at the negotiating table. Although my heart was thumping, I tried to be calm and answer with composure and strength, but also with courteous affability. I explained our good intentions and our wish to find a political solution to end our people's pain and suffering. At the same time, I expressed our determination to achieve inviolable freedom, independence, and unification for our country. At the end of the meeting, I breathed a huge sigh of relief because I had completed a very difficult assignment. Comrade Xuan Thuy phoned me with praise. "You were courageous," he said. Many French friends, especially the women, telephoned their congratulations, saying the broadcast was an important success. Days later, members of the press were still talking about that event. We were always looking for new initiatives to expand our influence. One action was very special. From Paris, we organized with our friends in New York an anti-war meeting coordinated across the Atlantic Ocean. At the appointed hour, our friends in New York phoned to inform us that everyone had arrived at the meeting hall. They asked us to speak to the meeting by telephone. I spoke, and Bin Tan interpreted. The applause was enthusiastic. We could not hear clearly when the Americans spoke, but we could guess the contents. This innovation contributed to U.S. understanding of our position and created greater sympathy. However, not every initiative was successful. We had noticed that more than a few senators and representatives in the U.S. Congress opposed the war.